Genetic learning. Life. Of course, the universal learning process, and thus meaning, becomes appreciably clearer to recognize when, around 3.8 billion years ago, we see its first truly sublime product, life, a particular kind of dissipative structure that can also reproduce itself via meaningful information. Such is the system environment knowledge contained in the genetic code. Here, meaning truly comes into view as the goal-directed character of biological behavior becomes overt and undeniable. On this point, the work of neuroanthropologist Terence Deacon has been especially elucidating, offering a profound contribution to the reappraisal of meaning and teleology in the biological sciences. Since Darwin, teleology had been summarily eschewed from naturalistic descriptions of life and its development, replaced instead by an emphasis on blind, meandering, and undirected chance. Having identified the crucial efficient cause of natural selection, that is, the basic material cause-effect mechanism, biologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries believed they could then dispense with the idea of any teleological final cause, such as Aristotle had once identified for organisms, which is to say, the idea that their end, goal, or purpose structurally informs them. Ultimately, however, the failures of a purely reductionistic biology to adequately explain biological organisms without reference to goals and aims has led to a paradigm shift in the field, as emergentist frameworks from complexity science have helped shed important new light on long-vexing problems about biological behavior. Deacon's work is a significant contribution to this paradigm shift. In his comprehensive 2012 book, Incomplete Nature: How Mind Emerged from Matter, he offers a scientifically robust and philosophically compelling reconsideration of teleology's role in biology. By emphasizing the inherent lack or need of goal-directed entities, i.e. their incompleteness, Deacon removes teleology from a speculative metaphysical register and places it comfortably within a processual physical one. This allows us to see the commonalities that exist between all entities intrinsically constituted in processual relation to an absent goal state. As he puts it, such concepts as information, function, purpose, meaning, intention, significance, consciousness, and value are intrinsically defined by their fundamental incompleteness. They exist only in relation to something that they are not. Such absence thus motivates, in the most basic etymological sense we might say, causes to move, animates, the behavior of biological entities. This dynamic is clearest in highly complex organisms like ourselves, who aspire, wish, will, intend, etc. Meaning and purpose are clear, we might say, within the PTB's person-society field of culture. But appreciating the deeper dynamic of motivational absence allows us to trace the quality of such meaning back down through less complex forms, which is precisely what we have been endeavoring to do here. As Deacon proposes, because it is complex, the concept of mental purpose can be progressively decomposed, revealing weaker forms of this consequence-organized relationship that do not assume intrinsic mentality. Thus, the concepts of function, information, and value have counterparts in living processes, which do not entail psychological states, and from which these more developed forms likely derive. To distinguish from the associations of purpose with more complex cognitive versions of intentional behavior, Deacon coins the term intentional, which can apply also to unconscious goal-directedness at the purely biological level. Intentional entities are teleologically driven. As Deacon puts it explicitly, intentional processes and relationships can best be classed as expressions of final causality in Aristotle's terms. In short, living organisms have meanings. But unlike in ancient theological or speculative metaphysics, such meaning is not an essence directly bestowed upon creatures by a transcendent creator, but rather a product of the intrinsic relational dynamics between an organism and its ecological context. That is, we might say, it emerges from the semantic information linking a biological organism with its ecological niche. As Deacon puts it, intentional processes have a distinctive and characteristic dynamical circularity, and their causal power is not located in any ultimate stuff, but in this dynamical organization itself. Our ultimate scientific challenge is to precisely characterize this geometry of dynamical forms, which leads from thermodynamic processes to living and mental processes, and to explain their dependency relationships with respect to one another. It is a quest to naturalize teleology and its kin. In thermodynamic terms, the telos of a biological organism is, like other dissipative structures, to remain far from equilibrium. Behavior directed toward this goal, for example a bacterium navigating toward nutrients through chemotaxis, is purposive behavior, and information that assists in this purposive behavior is meaningful information. What distinguishes the meaningful knowledge unique to life, however, is a novel information processing language, genetics. This, according to the Utah tree of knowledge, is what marks the emergence of a novel type of entity exhibiting a novel form of behavior. Whereas dissipative structures arise spontaneously and then disappear as conditions demand, life is different in that it has been able to persist and reproduce without interruption since its initial emergence some 3.8 billion years ago. By being able to store meaningful information in the genetic code and transmit this information through reproduction, an entirely new level of complexity has taken hold in the universe. Specifically, life stores meaningful information about the environment in DNA. With this, we begin to see an early form of representation in the cosmic learning process. Deacon stresses this aboutness as a crucial characteristic of the mutual information linking organism and ecology, writing, "Living organisms are far from equilibrium systems that are dependent on transforming the physics of their interaction with the environment into information about their environment. This is why organism features reflect the constraints of their environments, and what justifies claiming that the information embodied in a phenotype and its genotype is information about this environment. But this aboutness only reflects these environmental constraints with respect to the constraints of the formative processes critical to reproduction and self-maintenance of that organism. Meaningful information for biological organisms encodes relevant reference to the world that the organism inhabits. Such representations, however, are not stored in the memory of the individual organism. That does not arrive until the level of mind, when nervous systems and brains emerge. Rather, these representations are translated into the language of DNA itself. The very information that shapes the organism includes semantic information about its world. Organisms are embodied meaning. Crucially, though, life does more than store information about its environment, it also updates that information. Through the natural selection of evolution, meaningful information gets filtered according to environmental pressures, creating, over time, an increasingly intimate coupling between organism and ecology. The meaning inherited by an organism in its DNA is matched against its environmental conditions. As this signal gets transferred across generations, it is subject to entropy, just like any kind of Shannon information. This introduces variation in the signal, and these variant meanings can be better or worse adapted to their conditions. Better adapted informational couplings are selected and get carried forward, such that meaning comes to carry more significant information about the environment. In this way, genetic evolution and natural selection add a crucial pruning mechanism to the transmission of meaningful information through time. As Deacon puts it in his essay, Shannon, Boltzmann, Darwin, Redefining Information, quote, "What counts as useful information in biological evolution is determined after the fact with respect to its ability to pass through the functional error correction mechanism of natural selection. The accuracy of the inheritance signal is both tested and refined by the way the far from equilibrium dynamics that constitutes the organism's development, maintenance, and reproduction conform to the environmental constraints and opportunities. Evolution is thus a generator of information for the organism and a process that rectifies this information with its reference. Thus also the evolutionary process is itself non-normative. It produces organisms capable of making normative assessments of the information that they receive. In sum, evolution through natural selection behaves as a learning process at the level of life. It is the special mechanism at this level that allows meaningful knowledge to be stored and updated, furthering the complexification of energy, information, and structure. Deacon's mention of normativity above highlights a crucial point, however, and one that will become increasingly important as we move forward. That is, nature's learning process we have been describing produces knowledge that is meaningful only to the degree that it assists the entities producing it to better navigate their entity-field relationship. That is to say, information gets its causal power to the degree it is of value to the existence of the entity, i.e., whether it assists the entity in its goal to remain far from equilibrium. Value, then, is also an inherent product of the entity-field relationship. Value does not exist in and of itself, but in the dynamic adaptive contexts relating organism to ecology, animal to environment, etc. That is, in the process of energy informing structures adapted to specific environments. Another way to express this is to say that value, good versus bad, must be understood as deriving from the entity-field relationship, wherein there is a relative good for an entity as well as a relative bad for that entity. For a bacterium on the life plane, navigating via chemotaxis toward a collection of nutrients is good for its continued existence, aiding its efforts to obtain free energy to maintain itself in the face of entropy and so persist. Conversely, navigating into an area flooded by toxins is bad for the bacterium, threatening its basic integrity as an organism. Even though the single-celled organism is among the most primitive of entities on the life plane, we can still identify values for the organism, which have meaning for it as information with real causal power relative to its flourishing or annihilation. In fact, Deacon himself recognizes that this normativity actually goes even further back than life. He points to the example of autocatalysis, a chemical process whereby a collection of molecules reciprocally and recursively create more and more of themselves. This feedback loop is an intentional process in the sense that it is goal-directed and thus purposive in its behavior. More complex than a whirlpool, but still simpler than a full-blown living organism, it likewise has its form of normative value. As Deacon recognizes, functions are normative to the extent that they fail or succeed to achieve some end. So even these simple molecular systems have crossed a threshold in which we can say that a very basic form of value has emerged, because we can describe each of the component autogenic processes as there for the sake of the autogen integrity or for the maintenance of that particular form of autogenicity. Likewise, we can describe different features of the surrounding molecular environment as beneficial or harmful, in the same sense that we would apply these assessments to microorganisms. More important, these are not merely glosses provided by a human observer, but the intrinsic and functionally relevant features of the consequence-organized nature of the autogen itself. Surprising as it sounds, because meaning exists even on the level of matter, there is value even for purely material entities to the extent that they resist entropy and are thus goal-directed. Like meaning itself, this does not diminish the idea, but rather makes it all the more theoretically robust. Meaning and value exist not as mere social constructs or subjective inventions, but as real aspects of the world. They do not, we must stress, inhere in things themselves as essences bestowed, such as traditional theological thinking proposed, but neither are they purely subjective experiences overlaid on the world, such as modern reductionistic thinking has tended to assume. Rather, they arise in the dynamic relationship between an entity and its contextual field. Meaning is real because it is contextual. Meaning, you could say, is a real relationship. In terms of the Utah map of complexification, the life plane is defined by meaning processed as genetic information. Indeed, as many biologists have argued, the actual informational individual here is not so much the single organism as the broader gene pool, the species. Viability is adjusted for the group, not just the entity, so meaning transcends the organism. At the genetic level, meaning is fully collective, since learning is only collective at this stage. With time, though, through the success of viable species, still more complex information processing systems evolved. Specifically, a certain kind of multicellularity led to the emergence of neuronal nets that developed into increasingly complex nervous systems and integration of information that gave rise to an entirely new emergent dimension of complexity: mind. Cognitive learning. Mind.